Chapter 6, Jails. The first jail in the United States appeared in Philadelphia in 1773. It housed all regardless of sex, age, or offense. This penitentiary is Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. It is still there today. In fact, you can go and do tours of that prison. That's on my bucket list to do, so I hope to do that. But it was established in 1773. There was no, it didn't matter if, male, female, what offense was committed, you were all housed in there together. It closed in 1835, and a new prison was built, which was the current Eastern State Penitentiary. And it was the first of its kind in the world. Once the old jail closed, all the state offenders were sent to Eastern State Penitentiary. All others were transferred to the new county jail. So you can see how it's kind of like Alcatraz, where it's very old. This is older than Alcatraz, but you can see the state that it's in. But yeah, I would love to go and tour that facility. And we're going to talk about generations of jails. And I want you to look at that picture in the lower left-hand corner where it's like a corridor and it's got a tier and it just looks all the way down. This is a perfect example of a first generational jail. So remember this picture. We'll show you another one here in the next slide. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we're going to talk about jails through the generations, and the first generational jail had a linear design. So just like the other picture that we saw, it was a straight corridor down. And if you were in the middle in that control area, you could not see, for example, I'll show you with the laser, you could not see what these people were doing. If you're right here in the center, you might be able to see what they're doing, but not if they're in their cells. You wouldn't be able to see that. This is a linear design and kind of like a spoke of a wheel. And this was a first generational jail. You can also see it here, the way it was designed with that center area being a central location. So remember that with the generational jails. Next slide. The second generational jail. In the 1960s, we started to see some change in the way jails were being built. So the second generational jail had staff remain in a secure control booth surrounded by pods. So if you could look at this diagram and see how a control booth is visible and that person has view of what is going on in the pods. So that is a second generational jail. In the 1960s, that's when we started to see some change so that staff could better have observational ability to see what was going on. Surveillance is remote, so of course there's one person in the control booth and they only had the ability to surveil. Verbal interaction between staff and inmates is less frequent than in first generational jails. In first generational jails, you would have officers kind of walking up and down that corridor. But of course, unless you had someone in front of that particular cell at all times, you wouldn't know what they were doing. Property destruction is minimized in the second generational jail, and response time is for problems is low. So that was second generational. Okay, let's go on and talk about third generational. That is what we are in now. Basic premise with the pod. and having someone directly able to see what is going on in the pod. However, now you have direct supervision. So that means that you are going to have an officer or two actually in the pod with inmates. Usually, inmates are housed in small groups, thus, they have a pod. There are some prisons that have dormitory style, and those are more of the minimum. Um, at the maximum security that I worked at in Beeville, McConnell State Prison, they had the concept of pods, and you had different buildings. Each building housed a different classification level of inmate. For example, when I would go to 7 building or 8 building, 7 was medium, 8 building was close custody. So they didn't have quite as much um, leniency or freedom as maybe the minimum security did. But they were formed in pods sections. So you would have, for example, you would, I'm going to show you kind of with the laser, you would walk into a sally port here, and here would be a pod, and then you'd have a pod over here, and you'd have a pod over here, and a pod over here, and each pod was A pod, B pod, C pod, D pod, and in the middle of this you had a picket, you had a central location for this particular section, and the control picket could operate all the doors from within that picket. But in each pod, you have officers. And this is where that third generational comes in, is because they have direct supervision. So they actually have officers in the housing areas that are telling inmates when they need to rack it up, when they need to go to lunch, when they need to go to shower. There is a common area. This is called a common area, and usually in that common area you have tables where when they're out of their cells they can congregate, maybe play dominoes or something, watch TV, whatever the case may be. But with the third generational jails, it's very important to know that they are more directly supervised, and actually have officers that are working their shifts within the pod. Usually, what happens is at the beginning of the shift, you have a shift muster, which is where everybody gets together, and the sergeant and the lieutenant will be telling all the officers what is going on, what are you looking out for, be sure to watch out for this. It's just updating them on information. And then when they are released to go to their section, they're assigned a different section every day. So you never know when you go in what you're going to be assigned, unless that assignment has a permanent officer. But usually when you work the buildings, you don't know exactly what section you're going to work. What are you going to be doing? Are you going to be working in the pod? Are you going to be transporting inmates to and from medical? You just don't know until you go and you get your assignment for the day. That keeps complacency down. So when the other are coming onto shift, then they're relieving the officers that are currently there. So that is when shift change happens. Um, it's staffed 24 hours a day. So you know that all 3 shifts are going to be staffed with officers inside the pod. My particular job was an 8 to 5 job. So I didn't have shift work at the time. There were times when I would go in very early, depending on disciplinary court. There were times when I'd go in at 3 in the morning. Sometimes I'd go in at 4 or 5, just depending on what was on the court docket. But when I would go serve disciplinary cases to the inmates, I would have to go into these pods to go serve them their cases. So I would go in, there was an officer inside the pod. The officer would ask me, "Do you need me to go with you?" I would usually say no. and I would walk the pods and go to their house. You call the cell their house, and serve them their disciplinary case. If they were out of their cell and maybe showering, then I would come back later. Um, and if they were in the day room or the common rec area, I would just call out for the inmate, and the inmate would come, and I would serve them their disciplinary paperwork. Um, so it's very important to know that we are in that third generational right now. Direct supervision. There are 9 principles of direct supervision. Effective control, staff firmly establish their authority. Effective supervision, there's continuous supervision because there's always an officer in the pod, usually 2 officers. Competent staff, following the correctional standards and training. Staff and inmate safety, performance based data collected. So, again, when we talk about performance based data, we're talking about evidence based practices. Is what we're doing right now working? Is it shown to be working? Um, Manageable and cost effective operations. Now, with the newer prisons being built and new technology, there's different architect choices, there's commercial grade furnishings, equipment options. There are a lot of prisons in the state of Texas, and some of those prisons are extremely old, especially the Huntsville unit, the Walls unit. That's where the death chamber is. That prison was opened up in something like 1848. So you can imagine how old that prison is. It goes through renovations, of course, but it is never like having a brand new facility, state of the art, built, and you're working in that, and then you go to this old, dingy kind of prison. It happens. But remember, we have to be able to be sustainable with the taxpayers' money. So it's not like, okay, well, you've got this old prison. We don't want this old prison. We want a new prison. Well, then what is that going to do? That's going to cost taxpayers more money. So, in order to not have to do that, the state is going to continue to utilize these older prisons until they cannot anymore. Um, Effective communication, direct communication exists between the inmates and the officers, and between the officers and the supervisors. So communication is very important, especially in this third generation direct supervision setting. Classification and orientation, know with whom you are dealing. So I told you before that the maximum security that I worked at, the buildings were housed different security levels. Building 7 was for medium. Building 8 was for close custody. And then we had building 12. Building 12 was for administrative segregation only, or kind of um, the worst of the worst. So you had these different classifications. So you, as an officer, you need to know who you're dealing with. What security measure or what security level are you working with? Justice and fairness, unit officers have to exercise primary informal discipline. In other words, you are telling them to get to their house. If they don't get to their house, well, then you go up to them and you don't use aggressive measures, but you tell them and you try to reason and say, look, you get to your house, because if you don't, then something else is going to happen. And we don't want that to happen. So you reason with them. And then ownership of operations. You have to be able to own those operations and know what's going on. You can't afford not to know what's not going on. Next slide. Women in lockup. In the past 30 years, the numbers of women in prison has risen over 600%. According to your textbook, in 1985, there were approximately 19,000 women incarcerated. Today, that number has risen to over 115,000. Now, we're talking about in the United States. We're not talking about Texas. Um, but generally, there are not as many women in prison as there are men. But over the years, it has grown substantially, to where in 1985, we only had 19,000 women incarcerated. And recently, those numbers have gone up to 115,000 in the United States. So you can see how much it has grown. However, due to the pandemic, incarceration for women, it also started to decline. So it's on the decline right now. Who is the typical woman in lockup? Well, according to demographics, according to statistics, the typical woman in lockup is usually poor. They don't usually have a job that brings in enough money to support themselves. They are usually a high school dropout. They're low wage earners. They're unmarried with 1 to 3 children. They have been influenced by drugs or alcohol in the past. Approximately 46% have other family incarcerated, and more than half, 55%, have been physically or sexually abused. Now, these are not statistics that are made up. These are demographics. These are statistics that are taken when someone is going through the intake process in prison. This is what you do. You gather social information, you gather the demographics of who they are, what they did, what they've been through, and this is what we have come up with. 10 facts about women in jails. Lower safety risk than men. The pathway to crime is different than men. How they got to prison or how they got to jail is different than the path that men have taken. Participation in crime is related to their connections with others, usually their partner. So if you have someone, let's say a partner who is dealing in drugs and doing things that are against the law, more than likely you're going to be involved in some way, some kind of form to get you incarcerated. The history of victimization or trauma. Um, when we talk about those who um, have had problems with the law, and we talk about they come from a lower socioeconomic status. Unfortunately, what follows along with that is victimization, usually physical abuse or sexual abuse. And there have been programs that have been developed by the lens of managing men. So when we talk about that, what is the experience? Most of the experience, most of the demographics and information that come out are from male institutions. Why? Because there are more males incarcerated, and that's where most of these statistics come from. Assessment tools needed that are more accurate in identifying risk and needs. So state prisons need to come up with better assessment tools when it comes to women. What are assessment tools? Those are ways to assess whether or not someone is going to be successful in completing their sentence and successful in rehabilitation. Because the last thing we want is for somebody to be a recidivist, to come back into prison. So there are more assessment tools that are needed to be able to identify those risks that involve women. Respond favorably to evidence-based and gender-responsive principles. So also, state prisons, jails have the responsibility of using evidence-based information according to gender. What works best with the women? What works best with the men? Number 9, transition back to society is overwhelming due to their needs as mothers, less employment history, and greater levels of poverty. So let's look at that. If you have, and we're looking at the typical woman in lockup who is poor, who is not a high wage earner, they don't have a lot of school, they have children. Women are usually the nurturers. They're the mothers. They're the ones that take care of the kids. So, of course, usually they are the ones who fall back. Whereas the men are usually the earners in the family. They are the ones that are paying the bills. So a lot of times, especially in domestic violence, this is why women will not report their partner when domestic violence occurs, because he or she knows that their partner is going to end up getting fired. They're going to go to jail or to prison. So there's not going to be money coming in. So all this is taken into account. And that transition for them back out into society is a lot harder than it is for men, especially when they have children. Because, of course, they are expected to be the nurturers. And 10, technical violations that can result in recidivism is due to unmet survival skills, finding gainful employment, and safe housing. So when we look at men in prison, we already know that there is going to be some issues in finding employment because of the fact that you are asked, have you been convicted of a felony? And you have to answer that correctly because more than likely the company or the employer is going to do a criminal background check and your criminal background is going to come up. So it's already hard to find a job. And then when you're a woman who does not have a lot of experience in wage earning and has kids to take care of, it becomes even harder because they don't have those survival skills that the men have. And they usually end up finding someone that will be able to help them to give them a roof over their head, food on the tables, so that they can care for their children. There is a video on here. Go ahead and take a look at it about women in prison. Next slide. Mental illness and county jails. 20 to 26% of those incarcerated suffer from severe mental illness. This is a tough one because when you think about it, that's a big number, 20 to 26%. And let's look at, when we talk about jails, we're talking about the county jail. Let's look at Bexar County, for example. Bexar County has an inmate population of over 5,000. And when you're talking about 20 to 26%, you're talking about over 1,000 people having a severe mental illness. Jails are not equipped to handle mental illness. That is not why jails exist. Jails exist for punishment. It is a sanction, and it takes away someone's freedom. But when you have someone who has committed a crime but also is mentally ill, jails are not really equipped to handle that, especially for the number of people who have a mental illness. There are 6 major reasons why jails should not be used for those with mental illness. Mentally ill people usually have committed no crime. So, a lot of the mentally ill people that you find in prison may be homeless. Maybe they've done something minor, but because they're homeless, they end up in the county jail. Or usually, a lot of times, if they know that it's going to be cold outside or it's going to be very rainy, the weather's going to be very nice, they'll do something to get them arrested. And of course, they're usually not released on their own recognizance and they can't afford to pay bond. So they get to stay in the jail and have 3 square meals a day and be provided for. So, not a lot of the mentally ill people have committed crime of their own doing. County jails are overcrowded. I think right now at the current time, the Bexar County Jail is overcrowded by about between 250 and 300 inmates. And that's a lot, especially when you don't have the number of beds that you need. And that is why counties rely on probation so much. So the county jails are overcrowded. And when you have so many mentally ill people in jail that don't necessarily need to be there, it raises a problem. No real training in handling the mentally ill. So officers are trained to supervise and to keep the community safe from these individuals that have committed crime. They are not well versed in what to do and how to do anything that has to do with mentally ill people. They go through a little bit of training, but it's far from what is needed when you have mentally ill people incarcerated. It's just the same when police get called out for a maybe a mental health problem. There are some specially trained police that maybe can assist that. There are police that are assigned to a behavioral unit and they get some training, but police officers are there to enforce the law. They're not there to handle mentally ill people. Um, Usually no adequate detention rooms for those with mental illness, with a severe mental illness. Um, they have a tendency to hurt themselves, and so there's not adequate space for them. And psychiatrists often state that treating severe mentally ill is more difficult and often comes with huge challenges, especially in a jail setting. Go ahead and look at that video on mental health in the jail system. Next slide. So let's look at a few demographics overall in the United States. So you have the population in the United States at approximately 335 million people who live in the United States. What is the population according to race? White is 58%, Black 12%, Latino 19%. So this is the breakdown of the population in the United States. Of all people who live in the United States, 58% are white, 12% Black, 19% Latino. But then let's look at the population incarcerated according to race. It's saying that 31% of all white people are incarcerated, of Black people 32%, and Latino 23%. So there is, when you only have the Black population at 12%, but there is a 32% population incarcerated, then you see the disparagement of the numbers. and how many more minorities are locked up according to the population than there are white. As at the end of 2022, the racial breakdown of the U.S. prison population was Black 32%, white 31%, Hispanic 23%, and then you have the other races. The U.S. population is becoming more racially diverse. As of 2020, the racial and ethnic breakdown of the U.S. population was as follows: white alone, almost 58%, Hispanic or Latino, almost 19%, and Black, African American, non-Hispanic, 12.1%. So when we look at the diagram below, those males born in 2001, likelihood of imprisonment. So of males who were born in 2001, they may be the age of 23 or 24. So we're seeing that in all men, 1 in 10 would be incarcerated. Of white men, 1 in 20 would be incarcerated. Black men, 1 in 5 would be incarcerated, and for Hispanic men, 1 in 8. So you see those disparagement in the numbers according to the population and according to those people who are imprisoned. Next slide. Suicides. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, there are approximately 49 suicides to every 100,000 inmates, compared to the U.S. population of 22 suicides per every 100,000 people who are living and not incarcerated. So of those incarcerated, you have 49 suicides, and for those who are not incarcerated, you have 22. So you see how the pressures of being incarcerated raises the rate of suicides. Jail suicides typically occur during the first week of incarceration, especially for those who are not used to the system. And the burden becomes so much that the only way out for them is by suicide. Homicides. In 2000, there were approximately 17 homicides in U.S. jails. In 2014, that number increased to 25, and it was at its peak in 2006, where there were 36 jail homicides. And then sexual assault. Make no bones about it, there is sexual assault in prison. All those stories that you hear on TV shows and movies, they are very real. And there is a lot of sexual assault in prison. And prior to 2003, there was really no way of tracking sexual assaults. And then in 2003, the Prison Rape Elimination Act of 2003 was created. And this became a way for inmates to anonymously report a rape or a sexual assault. Rape often carries a huge stigma with it, especially for those who are non-participating actors, the ones who are forced into doing that. There is there's a label that is placed on someone who has been forcibly raped, who has been raped in prison, and that is called a punk. And so when someone has been punked out, that means that they have been claimed to belong to someone. So it does have huge implications in the system. So that Prison Elimination Act, the Prison Rape, I'm sorry, it's not rape. Prison Rape Elimination Act of 2003 is a way for the state to keep up with data. The last reported in 2018, there were 8,600 reports with only 547 that were substantiated. 1 in 10 former adult state inmates reported being sexually abused while in detention. That's a lot, when you think of we shouldn't have any, but unfortunately we do. Next slide. Jail facilities. Jails have a rated capacity. So jails are rated according to specific requirements. This also means determining the number of beds, which allow only a certain number of incarcerates. So, in the U.S. Department of Justice, they classify jail size into 7 levels. They have less than 50, which are usually maybe could be rehab facilities, they could be halfway houses, they could be some kind of detention facility, and then they number them off 7 ways where over 2,500, for example, the Bexar County Jail has a population of a little over there you go, 5,054. So they have an operating budget of 2.8 billion, and it costs approximately between $70 and $90 per day per inmate. So when you think about it, you take the cost of an inmate per day, let's just say 70, multiply that by 365, and you come up what it costs the taxpayer for 1 year to house one inmate. So it is a lot of money. Jail accreditation. It used to be that jails did not have to be accredited. So when we look at, for example, schools have to be accredited. They have to be shown to be following compliance orders, to be following mandates, rules, regulations, policies that have been set by the state. Well, jails are no different. They have to be accredited by the state, and there are things that have to be done in order to get that accreditation. If you lose your accreditation, that is not good. And Bexar County has had their accreditation stripped a couple of times until they get back on track. So there are 5 reasons jails have to have accreditation. It adheres to strict standards on health and safety of staff and inmates, defends itself against lawsuits, adopting better management practices, professional recognition and status, and jail standards now enhances small jails to be within these standards. So this is a way of making jails follow rules and regulations that have been set by the state or by the federal government to stay within compliance and to be accredited. That video that I have below is Bexar County Sheriff's Office out of compliance. That is when the jail got out of compliance and they lost their accreditation. They had to work to get that accreditation back. And that is it for this chapter. That is the last slide. Thank you.